So welcome. This session we're going to be talking about the legal system. This is lesson 2 in the Work Legally and Ethically unit. And you'd remember these are the 3 areas that we've been working on. This specific session is going to be looking at the legal area. I'm going to give you just a general overview of how our legal system works and how acts, common law and subsidiary laws work together. There's 3 different types of laws that I'll be describing, giving you an explanation of. I guess I could add a 4th, which is how our constitution, our general rule book works. Has anybody heard the term common law before? Okay, pretty much everybody. Does anybody know what it means? Pretty much nobody. Write down your idea, because I'd be interested to see if it's the same as what I say it is later. Is that can we make a deal with that one? So you got a definition. Okay, just write it down. We'll take a look after. So okay, that's an overview of the system, how the different types of laws work together. And I'll also be giving you a bit of a general example of laws as to how that all works. I'll run you quickly through the drug law stuff in the ACT. So you'd remember 3 general areas. Can you all remember what they are? 3 different areas. Yeah, big words at the top of the screen are probably a bit of a giveaway. For the time being, I'm just going to push aside the stuff about the agency policy and push aside the ethical stuff. We're just focusing on the law. Let's keep that in mind. Let's just push that up into the top corner as a little reminder that we're just talking about one of the 3 areas of the rules of how we work. We're talking about the law here. And I wanted to take it back to where Australian law pretty much started. These 6 gentlemen. These are the premiers of the different colonies in Australia. They've all met, and I'm not quite sure which is which. I seem to think the big guy over on the far side there is from West Australia, but I've got no real proof. These guys, they're just to set the scene here. They're meeting on a boat. It's a secret meeting to decide how the rules of Australia are going to work. So they're on a boat so that no one else can... Thank you. I put a lot of work, far too much. They're on a boat gently rocking off Botany Bay in Sydney so that no one else can disturb them, because they've got some serious business. They want to... These are the sons of the gold rush. So this is in the 1890s. Australia was first invaded, colonised, settled, call it what you'd like, in 1788 by white people. White people first settled in 1788 is what I'm saying. Thank you. As a penal colony, as a place to dump convicts and maybe establish a new settlement for the British. Everything moved along fairly slowly until the 1850s. Can anybody tell me what happened around about 1850? Thank you, the gold rush. They found gold. People started voluntarily coming to Australia. Still, it's seen as a British outpost at this stage. A bit of a power struggle happened. Sydney had always been the de facto capital city, and then because of the gold rush, Melbourne started growing, and to this day there's still a bit of antagonism between Melbourne and Sydney. Okay, that's 1850. This is actually happening in 1890. These 6 men are representing the children of the gold rush. They're saying, we've always lived here. Why should we feel like we're British? That's not really who we are. Why should we want to make our own rules. We don't want to be ruled by some country we've never even seen in a lot of cases and never will see. We want to be able to make our own rules. We're tired of being treated as second class. In fact, there's a bit of a class thing going on there as well. They don't like this idea of British upper class. They like everyone to be equal. That's what's motivated them to travel long distances by horse, boat or whatever to get to this ship here. And there's some things they can agree on. They've agreed, we want to keep this, we want to keep rule by the king, or as you know, today the Queen. We still want to keep our head of state as England. We've got no problem with that. We just like to make our own rules. What we do have a problem with is those stinking Chinese. They really didn't. Again, to this day, there's a bit of a fear that the Chinese are going to invade, that we need to, that they were trying to take things over during the gold rush. They're very racist, these guys, by today's standards especially. And they're scared because it's a big country and they could easily be invaded by the yellow peril, the yellow hordes, the Chinese coming from the north. And they've got to work together with that. So they reckon they could mobilise an army, but it needs a national approach. For example, they could probably get everybody way up north far faster if they could all agree on the same train gauges, so that trains could all link up eventually. But as it is, each colony has made their own, and someone's got to pay. If someone's going to change the size of their trains, then someone's got to pay for that, and there's a lot of distrust. It's a lot of awkward stuff going on. To defend from the north, remember, gold rush, kids. So during the gold rush, there's a bit of argy-bargy. There's a bit of conflict between the Chinese and the Anglo there as well. So they've all got that in mind. They're all agreeing on that much. They're also saying we need to have a united approach to industry. The way that we export our industry, the way that we work together. We want to be, working together. We don't want to be competing against each other. So we're happy to unite together, keeping the king in place for defence purposes, for industry purposes, for commerce purposes. Having said that, they are still 6 separate states. They actually invited New Zealand to the table, but they couldn't make it for whatever reason, and a lot of people would say it would never. The West Australian, that guy over there, I'm assuming that's him. The West Australians and the New Zealanders had polar opposite attitudes in a lot of ways. Treatment of Indigenous people being one that I'll mention in a moment, but lots of different things. Nevertheless, 6 territories. A lot of distrust sitting around the table here. A lot of fear, because most of the people live in Sydney or New South Wales and Victoria. A lot of fear that if the federal government has too much power, then the Brisbane, the West Australian, the Tasmanian, they're going to lose out because they'll always be outvoted. So part of what they needed to do for everybody to agree on how the rulebook's going to work for this new country is most of the powers are going to be kept at the individual state level, except for defence and trade, and one or two other items I'll talk about in a moment. But generally speaking, that's one of the key areas here. The states have the power by default. They have most of the power, except where it really needed to be a national approach. Defence, trade, etc. And they came up with an agreement where they said every 4 years, as part of this new rulebook, we're going to count how many people live in the country. And if let's say 50% live in New South Wales, then 50% of the taxes get paid to New South Wales. If I'm contributing 20% from my territory, my state, then I get 20% of the taxes. And that way we're not competing with each other on taxes, but it is a fair distribution. There's a problem with that. I'd mentioned there's a lot of distrust around the table. Looking at quite unfairly, pointing my finger at that guy over there, they could say, hang on, we don't trust this guy from WA. Because if we count the number of people, he's going to start counting all the Aboriginal people in his half of the country, people who he provides no services for. If anything, accusations are they're more responsible for enslavement and and genocide and yeah, bad stuff for Aboriginal people, not spending their money on them. But nevertheless, if we use that census, let's just say we're going to count everybody who lives in the country except Aboriginal people. Let's put that into the rule book, and that way the taxes are distributed fairly. So a couple of things here that are quite different to how we do it today if we had to write up the rule book, but nevertheless that's what we've got. That's how it happened. One of the interesting bits was they said, again, part of this trust between the states, they agreed if any one state had some rights of their citizens, no one's going to lose out by this. That was an underlying theme. So I don't want to become part of this Commonwealth of Australia if it means that my people lose out on stuff they had already. Now this became interesting because that one right there in the middle, that South Australia, bunch of radicals, they weren't a convict settlement, they weren't so much a gold settlement, that was just a nice place to live. Nice place to grow wine and to make churches and talk German and all sorts of different things that they were doing there. And part of their different philosophy on life is they had said, we're going to allow women to vote. That's always been the case since I've been alive. It's kind of weird to me to get my head round. But in those days, this was truly, truly radical. Only one other country had done that, which is New Zealand. But they nevertheless said no one's going to lose out, and so Australia became the second country to be allowing women to vote. And in fact, as an attempt to try to stop that going ahead, because there were people really not keen on the idea. Just to put it in context, in most of the world, most men couldn't vote either. You needed to be a landowner. And certainly a landowner without previous convictions and various other things. The egalitarianism that was part of these gold miners' sons was, we want everybody to be equal. But nevertheless, there were some who were still saying, women, the vote, seriously? You never know what they might vote for. To try to, as a last-ditch attempt, so they tell me, last-ditch attempt to try to stop women getting it, the Conservatives added a rider that said not only can they vote, but they can also run for Parliament. I think they lost a couple of votes that way, but still not enough. So Australia became the first country to allow women to not only vote, but to also run as politicians, which is, pretty good when you consider some of the other things up on the board there. Really egalitarian, if you're the right sort of person, is probably my summary as to how it would work. And they came up with a rule book full of all sorts of stuff about train gauges and about who's going to be the capital. There's a whole chapter on the capital city. Won't be Melbourne, won't be Sydney. It'll be somewhere between the two within the boundaries. They drew a line around a little country town and said, that's a separate territory. Okay, it's not New South Wales, it's not Victoria. Would you guys stop your fighting? That's going to be the capital city. You got it. That's Canberra. That's the ACT. They came up with a rule book with all that stuff that's not so important today and stuff that is. They came up with a legal system. Here's how Australians are going to make their own rules. They basically came up with an act of British Parliament that said, when this act has been passed by the King, Australians will now be able to vote. The Commonwealth of Australia Constitution Act. And part of how it's said is the states are going to keep the power, except where they've given that up to, voluntarily given that up to the federal government. As I said, defence, pensions was another. Sorry, defence, trade, pensions, they decided old age pensions or war widow pensions would be a national thing as well. States, generally speaking, had the power over everything else. So if something new comes about in the last 100 years, like say the internet, that gets ruled on a state-by-state level. They also said, we're going to keep a lot of the UK's courts and parliament, but we want to get rid of any suggestion that you're going to inherit the power to be a politician. It's going to be everything is voted. Every man, as it turns out, every woman as well, who's an adult can vote, and the laws will be written by Australians, by our government, and we'll have a court system. So there's state courts for state laws, federal courts for federal laws, different levels. That's all spelled out in the Constitution. And there's an underlying theme of equity, what I'd call egalitarianism, an equal playing field, no caste system, no class system, equality under the law. If you speed home along the GDE and I speed home and the Prime Minister speeds home and some lower class scum speeds home, they will all get the same penalty because the law would treat everybody equally. That's the theory they were working on. And the law was going to be clear and well understood and enforced fairly for everybody. That's the principles. That's how our rules work. So, having said that, that's the ideal that we work towards. That's the underpinning. Lawyers are motivated by this quite often, as well as the power and the money. I won't deny that. I don't want to go too much into that. I want you guys to split into groups and think about some of the barriers to this fairness and equality for people in general. What is stopping the law being that ideal that I was just describing? What's stopping it all being a fair and equitable system? Form into groups. I'll give you 5 minutes. Give it some thought. We'll bring our ideas together afterwards.